to go digging.
Okay.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some media use these platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
The following is a pattern interruption of your regularly scheduled brainwashing program.
Welcome to the Reality OS. I'm Peter Duke, and I'm joined by Tracy. Blah 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 blah. Good. I'm joined by Tracy Connors and Lee Stranahan today to talk about what's going on in the world. How you doing, Tracy?
I'm good. How are you, Peter?
I'm definitely not a professional broadcaster like Lee Stranahan.
It. No. You overthink it. Lee does this stuff on autopilot, so I want to give Lee the honors of telling people to tweet this out the way that he can do.
Sure, tweet this out. While you're here, retweet this puppy, and I'm on 105.5 FM, AM 1390 in. See, that's the part that I can do in my sleep, my radio call sign thing. But I'll stop talking like that now and just be normal.
Well, that's okay. The more words that we can shove into a shorter period of time, the more attention that we'll get from people, right?
Maybe.
I don't know. Yeah, it's all maybe, right? So what are we talking about today, Tracy?
Well, we wanted to see if Lee had anything he could add to that McClatchy article that we kind of touched on yesterday that was dealing with the CIA whistleblower, Steve Stegall, talking about how these voting machines can be hacked. And he mentioned that there was something that went on in the Ukraine election in 2004. And both you and I think Ukraine, who's the best person to talk to about that? It's Lee Stranahan.
Yep, Lee was way ahead. I think, Lee, are we on 4 years now that you've been talking about this story? Pretty close.
Yeah. I started on Russiagate. I was covering the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2015. Okay, so let's go back. I was covering the Occupy Wall Street movement when that blew up and was created in 2010, 2011, right around there. And then that led to the Black Lives Matter movement. Then I was the lead investigative reporter for Breitbart and covering a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement stuff and covering the political conventions, 2012 and then 2016 for Breitbart. And I started to notice the Russiagate thing strongly when WikiLeaks did that first drop between the Democrat and Republican conventions in 2016. WikiLeaks dropped some material. One of the stories that came out right away then was Donna Brazile had leaked the answers to questions to the Clinton team that she got through her CNN connection. Donna Brazile, of course, now employed by Fox. Now, she'd done that thing, and she immediately blamed the Russians. Immediately. So we don't even know if it's true. It could be Russian interference. We don't know. And I thought that was weird. And so I started to look into it then. And then I got Roger Stone involved in the story by writing a piece that I had an idea for an article saying that the Democrats are saying it's Russia, but we actually know who it is. In theory, there's a guy taking credit for it, I guess, named Guccifer 2. I have real questions about who Guccifer 2 is now, but leave that aside. There was somebody out there taking credit, saying, I did it, and dropping documents. And I wanted to do a story about that. And I knew Breitbart wouldn't give it much
Carriage?
Air. I was going to say column inches, but it's an online publication, so that doesn't really matter. But I knew they wouldn't give it much air because my name was not Yiannopoulos or Shapiro. And at the time, if your name was Yiannopoulos or Shapiro and the first name was Ben, or you were Ben's dad writing secretly under an alias, which he was, as you know, they wouldn't give you, it didn't make any difference. You could cover any story. And so I called Roger Stone and I said, hey, I've got an idea for an article. I'd like to write it as Roger, because I'd ghostwritten for him before for a Huma Abedin article. And I'd gotten to know him a little bit then. I liked him. And on the Huma Abedin article, he just said, hey, do it. Because I read what he wrote. And he wanted me just to fact check it. And I ended up saying, can I just rewrite this? And it's fun to write like Roger Stone. Because it is.
Because he's a little over the top, right?
That's right. That's right. And it's fun to write like that. And just, okay. So anyway, I called Roger. I said, I've got this idea. What do you know about this whole Russia thing they're talking about? He said, not really. He said, I'm not really following it. So I know for a fact that Roger didn't know anything about this. And then we went back and forth through emails. The editors from Breitbart, Alex Marlowe and Bannon, were on the email chain with the various things of this. Bannon signed off on it, and the article went up under Roger's name. And that's how Roger got involved in this. That's how he got on the radar. That's how he ended up texting with Guccifer 2, as I did as well. And then I kind of famously tweeted out to Adam Schiff. I said, I'm the one who introduced Roger to Guccifer 2. And all I meant was, I'm the one who wrote that article and everything. But I didn't have anything to do with their communications. But I know what I got from Guccifer 2. And so, yeah. So I've been following the Russiagate thing for a while. That led to Ukraine. So that's the background. But, Tracy, can you do me a favor? Because you did a little bit. Because I want to riff off that article, that McClatchy article. Could you just describe that for people the way you would describe it? And then I'll talk about what I saw. But
So we went over this a little bit yesterday, Lee. We jumped on and did it. So let me pull it up really quickly. That was called, let me see, CIA voting machines. So the premise of the article was from McClatchy News, March 24th, 2009. So this was a guy that came forward to talk about the CIA had been monitoring foreign countries' use of electronic voting systems, monitoring, whatever that means. And so it mostly starts out talking about Venezuela, and we've now come to know about the ties between this Smartmatic system and Venezuela, and specifically Chavez. And then buried kind of far down, he goes off on this tangent that Stegall, and that's the name of the CIA guy, Steve Stegall, he said that the opposition leader, Viktor Yushchenko, is that how you say that one?
Yeah, that would be Yushchenko. Yeah, Yushchenko. Yeah,
Yushchenko lost the 2004 presidential election runoff because supporters of Russian-backed Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych introduced an unauthorized computer into the Ukraine Election Committee national headquarters. They snuck it in. The implication is that these people were making subtle adjustments to the vote, in other words, intercepting the votes before it goes to the official computer for tabulation. And then the kicker is taped cell phone calls of the ensuing cover-up led to nationwide protests and a second runoff, which Yushchenko won. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because 2004, wasn't that the first go-around at a color revolution in Ukraine?
Yes, I think that was the orange, that was the official name of it. That was the Orange Revolution. But let me give you what I think prove to you is what actually is going on here. And it's a complete different take than that on that article. What you are seeing right now is that Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani are wittingly or unwittingly part of a CIA deep state operation to trick and lie to people on the right. Now, that's where we're headed with this, but let's start with this article. What you're seeing in that article is a CIA person making claims about the 2004 Venezuelan election. Okay? So let's be clear on this. He's not a whistleblower any more than Eric Charmella was a whistleblower. He is a CIA operative, agent, officer, whatever his role in the CIA is, making statements, and he's not making them because he's interested in getting the truth out there or the facts out there. He's pushing a CIA narrative. That doesn't mean it's not true, but that's not his job. His job is not to report the truth. His job is to report what the agency, what the people in Langley want him to report. Now, why are they saying this? And before I take you through some of this, I just want to give people a little bit of the way I see this stuff. So let's start here. Let's start with George Soros, okay? Because as you'll see, he plays a role in everything we're about to talk about here. George Soros, is he pro-communist? Is he pro-left? Is he pro-communist or not? That should be an easy one, right?
He seems to be pro-left.
He sure does. He funds a lot of groups on the left in the United States. However, as I'm going to show you in a second, he was working against Hugo Chavez. And we'll be able to find that on the Open Society Foundation's website. And I'll tell you exactly where to look because you can find it in just a second. And in places like Ukraine, he's literally supporting Nazi groups like the Svoboda Party and Pravy Sector. I don't speak Ukrainian. Pravy Sector, right sector, basically, in Ukraine. Now, this is difficult for people because they correctly think of Soros in the United States as a funder of the left. And that's exactly the way Soros and the people backing him want you to think of him. Soros, you can find this easily, for instance, funded the Atlantic Council to the tune of millions of dollars. The Atlantic Council, a key player in Russiagate and the Russiagate hoax, is basically the PR arm of NATO, right? So, okay, so Soros is pro-left. You'd think he'd be against NATO. He's not. He's a funder of the Atlantic Council. And he's a funder of groups such as, for instance, Human Rights Watch. Now, to understand the kind of big picture here, you need to understand how Soros funding works with elements like the CIA and groups like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID. Okay? So you've got the CIA, which operates more or less secret. It's not supposed to operate on U.S. soil. Eric Charmella disproved that, but okay. Then you've got groups that are more public, like the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, and USAID. And by the way, Obama's mother was connected with those groups. If you look into that history, just interesting there. So the way they work is they are a more public face. You will never see this, you don't really see stories hardly ever like the CIA granted $100,000 to blah, blah, blah. You never see that. You see it through the NED and USAID. Okay? Now, the way they work is they work in conjunction with NGOs and what's called civil society. Civil society is basically just everything that's not government or business is considered civil society. And it's everything from NGOs, charities, political organizations, sports teams. They're all part of this. And that's why when I covered the first big American Antifa rally in New York, it was sponsored by the New York Cosmos soccer team, a local soccer team in New York. And we had footage of the people planning this, organizing it, talking about it afterwards. I caught that. And so civil society is very wide. Now, what Soros does is he is a funder, not just of a group here or a group there. He funds hundreds of groups. And the reason he does that is because that way you create an echo chamber. Okay? So let's say he funds Human Rights Watch, which he does. Let's say he does, okay? So now you get this organization who's funded by the CIA, like NED. They make a claim, let's say, And then they're backed on it by Human Rights Watch. And then maybe a journalist from one of the multiple journalist organizations he funds. Maybe they come out, the Center for Public Integrity or something like that, which John Solomon was at for a while, by the way, Soros-funded organization. He'll come out and say something. And now you've got Human Rights Watch, you've got Solomon, let's say, okay, and you've got the NED, and they start to bounce off each other. Because now Solomon will say, well, the people at Human Rights Watch tell us blah, blah, blah. Or he'll say, the NED post. Now, none of what I'm telling you here is theoretical. And it all relates, aside from the Solomon thing.
I have to go dig it up, but I think I read a Rockefeller paper a couple of days ago where they were describing exactly that strategy of funding hundreds of organizations in order to create these echo chambers.
In fact, by the way, most people who know a bit about Soros have heard of the Open Society Foundations, right? Fewer of them know who International Renaissance is. International Renaissance is the group in Ukraine that funds every NGO in Ukraine. And certainly every anti-Russian one.
Interesting name, Renaissance, too.
It is.
Because there's Renaissance technology in the United States, too, which is the Mercers.
And they factor into some of this, and I haven't been able to figure out, but it is I agree with you. It's an interesting name. So a lot of people don't know that he funded International Renaissance before Open Society. Open Society actually came second. His first interest was going over to places like Poland and Ukraine, and literally he would write a check to every group over there, every group, because once he starts writing checks, he's got you a little bit. You see what I'm saying? That's how you can take groups like, for instance, on the left in the U.S. that used to be anti-war, the ACLU or whoever. They used to oppose war. Now they're just on board. They used to oppose the deep state and file suits against us. They don't do that anymore. Why? Because they're getting that Soros money. So let's talk very specifically about Venezuela, and some of the groups that I talk about are going to come up. So Hugo Chavez was elected, and I don't like communism, and I'm not a Chavez fan. However, he's sitting on one of the largest oil reserves in the world. Venezuela is one of the largest oil reserves in the world. And one of the first things he did was nationalize Venezuela's oil. And he's very popular, and anybody can look this up, with the poor people in Venezuela. And he's not very popular with the people who'd acquired wealth under the old system, right? So he gets elected. Then in 2004, a recall is called for. Now that recall is by a group called Sumate, S-U with a little thingy over it, M-A-T-E. And anybody can look this up. Sumate is funded by, in part, about 6% on the books by the National Endowment for Democracy. And they said, we need a recall. So when I see that NED money coming in, and when I see where it's coming from, this is a CIA operation. It's a color revolution coup. They want to get Chavez out, and it's not because they care about human rights, period. I don't believe that for a second.
That's always the cover. That and democracy.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. And of course, so they say this group says we need a recall. So they organize a recall. And the recall goes Chavez's way. It actually gives him more power because he wins by a couple million votes. Now, independent groups look into this and they say it's a valid election. They were on the ground, there were observers there. Not a single official group, including American groups like the Jimmy Carter Center, who doesn't really seem to have a dog in the hunt, they looked at it and they said this is a valid election. Observers who were on the ground said it's a valid election. Who said it's not a valid election? The Sumate group, funded by the NED. And then Chavez says there's an attempt at a coup here. And he starts looking into the people at Sumate and charges a couple of them with treason. Who springs to their defense? Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch jumps in. Now, I mentioned that Soros has a group under Open Society Foundation, and it's called, I believe, Venezuelan People for Access to Information, something like that. If you look up Venezuelan, it's right on the Open Society's Foundation list there. This is a group that's backing Sumate, NED, Human Rights Watch. It's all part of that. So now we have this guy from the CIA come and say, hey, look, voting machines, and look at the countries they bring up. They bring it up in Ukraine because they opposed Yanukovych. Yanukovych was not, he ended up being pro-Russia, but Yanukovych was open. He ended up going, I mean, he was seriously looking at NATO and the EU's offer. The EU came in and offered to bail out Ukraine because it was in a huge financial mess. So did Putin and so did Russia. He looked at the two offers. He thought the deal with Russia would be better. Paul Manafort urged him to take the EU deal. Manafort, who gets smeared as pro-Russian, was nothing of the sort. He gets smeared as being that, but you can look it up in the New York Times. He's not that. And so what happens is this is a CIA overthrow operation in Venezuela. And that's why they're bringing it up now. This stuff about, I'm not saying the reality about Smartmatic, let's say, and about Dominion, I don't completely understand. What I know is Smartmatic came out a year or two ago against Maduro, Chavez's successor, against Maduro. So they're not pro-Venezuela. They were anti-Venezuela, but the CIA and everybody else, we see this throughout Russiagate. We see it with people like Carter Page. People who were working with the U.S. government get burned. Manafort, over and over and over again by these people. They have no problem with burning these people. It doesn't make any, they call them Putin puppets and everything else. They were nothing of the kind. Carter Page helped convict Russians on espionage charges. He was not pro-Russian. He'd work with them. Didn't make any difference. And so what you're seeing right now, and I knew it because a couple things. I started to see moves by people on the right in the past few weeks to gin up this narrative that Putin and the Russians were really pro-Hillary. Now, if you know the story and if you know anything about the relations, it's completely false. And even reporters who get a lot of stuff right, like Chuck Ross over at the Daily Caller, he published a story that said, basically, oh, look, this Russian oligarch was working with the Atlantic Council. He doesn't point out that the Atlantic Council is connected to NATO, by the way. Chuck doesn't, not anywhere in the article. But he's trying to insinuate that the Russians somehow were like pro-Hillary, wanted Hillary in. Nothing is further from the truth. They are clearly, anybody who looks at that history can see the problems there. Russia was decimated under the Clinton administration, under Yeltsin. Russia as a country was decimated. Life expectancy went down. Blood was running the streets of Moscow because these oligarchs, all of whom were backed by Clinton, as Yeltsin was backed by Clinton. And so I started to notice this, and I went, gee, why is this happening? And I noticed this guy, J. Michael Waller. Now, I've run into Waller before. He's over at Center for Security Policy. And I know people at Center for Security Policy. I know Frank. I've worked for them. I know Claire over there, ex-CIA. So they clearly do have CIA connections at Center for Security Policy. But Waller's a guy who worked with NATO. He worked with the NATO publication, and
he founded it. I think he was I think he founded that NATO publication.
He may have been. I'm trying to understand how that connects to the NATO Stratcom journal, because that's where Jeff Geisia, who's a Peter Thiel guy, who I've written about before, Geisia funded Deplorable. He's the Bohemian Grove descendant who funded Deplorable. So I first encountered Waller a couple of years ago because at CPAC they had The Night for Freedom, and they had a film by Mike Cernovich and Jack Posobiec. Now, and again, Peter, I'm not trying to think.
Yeah, you and I was with you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And
I think that you and I both had similar feelings about that movie at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, I did, and again, I don't want to get look. People have relationships. This is what I think. You mentioned Tim Pool earlier. This is what I think screwing up Pool. You see, he goes, well, I know Mike Cernovich. And in that one long interview he did with the guy who used to be at Vice, Waller came up. Now, he's been on my radar since then because that film was a smear piece. It was using Cernovich and Posobiec's reputation as free speech advocates to say basically you should shut down Al Jazeera. We shouldn't have Al Jazeera. And I think that personally, I think that was a reaction to, and again, I by the way, I wouldn't work for Al Jazeera.
Sure. So I'm unclear about what the genesis of that film actually was. I mean, I do know.
I don't even know what film you guys are talking about.
It's called Blood Money.
Okay.
And it's it's not a great film. It's pure propaganda. Dave Reboy's in it, and Mike Waller is in it, and Mike and Jack and Mike Cernovich. But it's so ham-handed. And my comment to the guys at the movie was, if you're going to do propaganda, you shouldn't be so obvious about just doing a bunch of testimonials about how one entity are bad guys. It's not a very persuasive. It wasn't. I didn't think it was very well done. That was my biggest criticism of it. But again, I'm unsure of the genesis of it. I know that Mike Cernovich put his name on it, but
that's the way they pitched it. But it was obvious to me it was the Center for Security Policy project, and the fact that Reboy was, and again, I know David. I like David. I've stayed at David's apartment. I like David, and so none of this is like personal. But I was talking to my girlfriend the other day, trying to describe this film, and I used exactly the same words. I said it was very I think I said ham-fisted.
Ham-handed. Yeah.
Yeah. I may have changed it to fisting because I'm like that. But I really did. I used the same phrase because it was clumsy, and Mike put his name on it, but it was obvious to me what they were trying to do was that was not a Mike project.
No,
it's nothing
wasn't.
He'd ever talked about before. It's nothing he ever thinks about. And whoops, sorry about that. And so that's when Waller got on my radar, because he said a number of things that I just know aren't true about Russia in that. I'm like, who's this guy and why is he doing this? And this has to go. And again, I work for Radio Sputnik, which is, Russian government funded media, but I don't take orders from anybody. And I have a new show called The Backstory.
Every day, 4 to 6 p.m.
4 to 6
Eastern.
p.m., yeah. And it's great. I'm the only host, and it's great. And we're able to cover a lot of stuff.
And that's a radio show, right?
It's a radio show, yeah.
He live streams it, though. It's on YouTube.
Yes, with fantastic graphics, Peter.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think you have more freedom than any other journalist who's not just a straight-up independent researcher.
I totally do. And it's amazing. And again, I have a history of quitting places when they restrict my freedom. I quit HuffPost when I used to write for them. I quit Breitbart after Andrew died twice or 3 times or whatever. Every time they got in the way of me telling a story that was important, I don't throw hissy fits, but I would just, if I came in one day and they're like, we have to say this, and it's not true, I'd go, bye. Okay, bye. And I just go do something else because it's not worth it to me. So I started to see this trend on the right. And Waller's important. I'll explain why he's important in a second. He's directly important to the Sidney Powell stuff. And I started talking about it a little bit on my radio show last week. I'd seen his connections to Cernovich and Posobiec. I knew Cernovich and Posobiec's connections to Jeff Geisia, who, as I say, funded Deplorable. And he's written for Stratcom. I have a big article that I wrote a couple of years ago up on populist.tv. Very detailed, full of links. Click the links. Everything's proven. And I started to see this thing of like, okay, well, let's really try to tie the Democrats to Russia. And it's been quietly building, but I saw it very explicitly. And so then when I saw the press conference the other day, and they started talking about Venezuela and Chavez, and I'm like, there's something weird here. There's something weird here. Now, the other day, Sidney Powell was talking about an affidavit that she's got from a whistleblower that's Venezuela. Well, guess who posted that? Was J. Michael Waller. It's on his site. How did he get a copy of it? Okay, whatever. Why is he posting it? Well, he's not going to answer me. But when I looked at the document, the thing that immediately became clear to me, I'm going through a divorce, okay? I've filed a few affidavits in the past year. I know what an affidavit looks like. And what an affidavit looks like, it's a sworn statement that you, in my case, you go to your lawyer, you may have a notary in the office, you go in my case to like the UPS store, they've got a notary there, but there's a line at the bottom, you sign it, you put your name, you put your date, and then the notary takes their seal, they stamp it on there, they put their name and all their info on. I looked at the document J. Michael Waller posted. I didn't see a notary seal. I didn't see, not even redacted. And on the last page, where and there's redactions throughout the document, I could see, and if there was like clearly, okay, that's where the notary signed, but they blacked out their name, I would actually get that. I'd go, okay, they're redacting that. There was no notary seal. There was no notary signature. There was no notary date. There was no signature redacted either. The person's name was right below there. That was redacted. And so I said, this does not look to me to be an affidavit. It looks to me to be an unsworn statement. Maybe they have an affidavit somewhere, then they should post that. So that's when my alarm bells really started to go off. And I started to go, okay, well, why is Waller in on this? And now, if you look up the claims about Venezuela and about that election being stolen, every one of them traced back to this one guy, Steve
Stegall.
Stegall, not Seagal,
No.
Totally different one. But Stegall with a T and an I. Every one of them traced back to this one guy making this claim about the Venezuela election. That when you look into it, you see the NED funding of the group that I mentioned earlier. You see, when you look into it, you'll see the Soros funding, and you'll see this seems like a CIA operation to me. This seems like a CIA cover-up operation. That's why I say, wittingly or unwittingly, Powell and other people on that legal team, including Jen Ellis, who's people have probably seen her very anti-Trump statements, very anti-Trump, in a way that's hard to think she would walk them back, because she was basically sounding the alarm about Trump's narcissism. And here's the thing, the way she was doing it, first off, it's not a question in my mind Trump's a narcissist. Just he names buildings after himself, okay? But I don't hold that against him. I go, a lot of people in politics at that level are going to be narcissists or have an ego or whatever, anybody. And Trump's a New Yorker, and so he's very blunt about it. But she was doing it in a way that's like, why would you support this maniac? And that's hard to walk back to me. It's like It's because it's a personality characteristic. He's, I'm not diagnosing him. Maybe he's not actually literally a narcissist, but he's got an ego. Let's put it that way. I know what she's talking about. So does everybody. And you either like that about Trump, and I kind of like it, or you don't. You just go, okay, he's a salesman, blah, blah, blah. He's a New Yorker. He goes a certain way. So I'm very, very skeptical. And when they started attacking Tucker, who is the only mainstream American journalist who even questioned Assad gassing his own people in Syria, and I went over and I covered that. In 2013, I went to Beirut, talked to people. Obviously all BS. Obviously. Very clearly, that's a BS narrative. And Tucker Carlson's the only guy who called that out. And Tucker's consistently good. And I noticed that overnight, I woke up one morning and suddenly everyone hated Tucker. I'm like, well, that's weird. That's not the guy I'd be hating on right now. And they've made it a litmus test. And so my Twitter feed is festooned with hate right now. And with people who are like, well, don't be divisive or we'll kill you, like that kind of thing. That seems a little divisive.
Well, one of the things that Tracy, it's interesting because we started off, I think, talking about Democrats or the left or Republicans and the right. And
yeah,
one of the things that, Tracy and I started this podcast because she and I were basically having phone calls every few days, and we were talking about this stuff, and we thought, these conversations probably would be pretty good for other people to listen in on. So that's was the genesis of this thing. And one of the things that we have been talking about is whether or not this left-right thing is really just a big charade, right? That's designed in order. It goes back to Caesar's Gallic Wars and divide and conquer strategy, and you need to create equal amounts of tension on both sides in order to be able to control populations and to get them to move in the direction that you want to go in. And to that end, there's kind of we can call the CIA the CIA, but I would say that there's a left-wing CIA, which is the Harvard-Yale side of the CIA, and there's a right-wing CIA, which is kind of the Stanford-Claremont side of the CIA. And likewise, if when you look at countries, you have to have a Straussian boogeyman. You have to have Russia man bad or China man bad or whatever it is, the external threat to your country. And then in order to be able to facilitate that, then you need to have journalists in place that will, carry water for you, who will basically tell the messages that you need to have in order to keep this strategy of tension going. And so there's a little, give and take, it goes back and forth a little bit, but, it's interesting that today is, the anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and Wikipedia still says that Lee Harvey Oswald is the lone gunman, when clearly I think about 4,000 books have been written by, Roger wrote a pretty good book on the JFK assassination. And there is no consensus that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. There's tons of evidence that it was some combination of the CIA, the mafia, organized crime, and yet those stories they get buried. They don't become New York Times bestsellers, and people act as if it's never going to be. No one is ever going to really know, and at this point, nobody may ever really know. But I also noticed in that Ukraine Unraveled movie that you made that the politician that Oliver Stone was Yanukovych.
Yanukovych,
that he was that apparently after the Maidan massacre happened, they immediately passed a law giving everyone immunity or from prosecution for any kind of participation in that.
That Ukraine is one of the I first off I agree with you, and I trace a lot of this back to the birth of what I consider the modern world, which is mid 18th century, where you start to get industrialization and you start to get travel and communications revolutions. That
There's a really good book about that called The Birth of the Modern, actually, that I read.
By who? I haven't heard that.
I can't remember. It's about 900 pages. I'll look it up while you're talking.
No, thanks. So,
Yeah.
so I look at a lot of that, and including the birth of the CIA, including the birth of groups like the Council on Foreign Relations. These all trace back to Cecil Rhodes, and around the time just after the Civil War. Basically, if you look at American history, up until the Civil War, the British were our enemy. We didn't like them. We broke away from them. They built the Confederate Navy, for instance. The Brits built the Confederate Navy. Everything but the dreadnoughts were built in Liverpool. And we didn't like them. They burned the White House in the War of 1812. And suddenly, I view it like let's say you break up with somebody, and then they win the lottery. And then you go, well, I don't know, they were pretty good. Maybe I can get back together with them. Because, I don't know, they weren't that bad. And so basically, look what happened in the U.S. in the mid-19th century. It's much bigger than the British had thought it was. And it's got this stuff out west, and there seems to be gold there. And so suddenly they're like, hey, maybe we need to be friends again. And Cecil Rhodes and that group of people, Milner's Kindergarten they were called,
Yep.
they wanted to create Anglo-Americanism and bring the British and the Americans, hey, let's be friends again.
Well, they wanted to put the empire back together.
Yes. Yeah. And they did it by going, and they realized that slavery as an institution was basically over with, because people were like, no, we don't want to do slavery anymore. So rather than doing
slavery, they were building machines that replaced slaves, and they wanted people to buy the machines. So but they still wanted the resources. So they took something like South Africa and said, well, let's just leave the slaves there. Let's claim South Africa, create diamond mines, control the diamond mines, so we create an international monopoly. Cecil Rhodes founded the De Beers Diamond Company. The people who tell you should spend 4 months' salary on an engagement ring because they made that up. They created and created the Rhodes Scholarship.
Exactly
famously, Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar.
And that's actually, I worked backwards. I drifted backwards into this. I saw Clinton's connections through Oxford, which is where a lot of this stuff came out of, this whole group. And they influenced everything from journalism. W.T. Stead was part of this group, and he's the founder of modern journalism. He died in the Titanic, but he's the founder of investigative journalism and tabloid journalism, and of really controlling the narrative for these wealthy elites who've run things forever. And Rhodes was a vowed racist who wanted to protect the empire, and they wanted to use the U.S. to do it. And if you trace this line through 1917 and World War I, the end of World War I, they formed Chatham House in the UK. The American versions
at the same time that they created the Council on Foreign Relations.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yes, which came right out of Chatham House, and that leads to the Trilateral Commission and all these other things that I thought were wacky conspiracies, but turn out to be accurate. And they use secret societies like Skull and Bones at Yale, and I've had guests on my show like Alexander Mercouris, who talked about that secret society thing is very British, and it's the way everything operates. It's don't put it on paper. It's all gentleman's agreement over tea and crumpets, and that's the way they operate. And he said, I can see the U.S. is becoming more like that. There's a country that we absolutely know interfered in the election in 2016. 100%. There's not a question about it. It's the UK. Christopher Steele's a British.
It's not only the British though, because the Illuminati, which was kind of the modern genesis of secret societies, was Bavarian. And they were kicked out of Bavaria when it was discovered that they were planning the French Revolution.
Well, and a lot of people forget, if you go back in the history, a lot of people forget that the royalty in England used to not speak English.
Yeah, they were Saxe-Gotha.
And French. They would speak French. English was the rabble language. And so these groups and the
Windsors are Germans. So but to your point, this kind of speaks, and this is where it starts to get really conspiratorial, right? Is that or sound conspiratorial, I should say, is that nations to these people are kind of the chess pieces that get moved around on the board. I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski called it the grand chessboard, for a reason. And that's because, like you said, the British ran out of monarchs, so they just moved a German over, and the Germans took over. And before that, it was the reason that the Germans had to take over is because the Dutch ran out of the Dutch, who had taken over England before that, ran out of successors.
Right. Yes.
And strangely, the last Dutch queen had 17 miscarriages or child deaths or something like that. There was a movie made about it about 2 years ago. Won the Academy Award, I believe.
My girlfriend made a joke yesterday where someone had said, where do kings come from? And she said, incest. And you know what? It's funny because it's true. And but I thought that was a good one-word semi-quip.
It is pretty good. It is,
but right, it is true. Yeah. And so these people have been trying to figure out how to hold on to money and power. Duh. That's not a conspiracy. Duh. That's what they're trying to do. And in the modern world, they figured out the way to do it is through advertising and propaganda, which starts at education and continues on through journalism. And it's very clear. And the CIA, to the point that you were making earlier, the CIA we actually know how it came up. And I'll tie this right back to Kennedy. Truman authorized the CIA in 1947. Their first operation was election interference. Anybody can look this up. In Italy, the CIA's first official operation was election interference. They were trained from, and this goes back to what I said about England's view of the U.S. We got money and muscle. That's what we've got. And so the British had the know-how on the spy game. And then they'd use us for money and muscle. And that's the way they would work with the CIA. That's why people like James Jesus Angleton were so close to Kim Philby, for instance. The British in the U.S., in the predecessor to the CIA, was working directly hand in hand. And by the way, I was talking to my girlfriend about this as well. It's very interesting. A lot of the CIA people, Peter, you'll find that, Tracy, you'll find this interesting too. They're all artists. It's really interesting. They were artists like James Jesus Angleton was friends with, knew Ezra Pound, the poet, right? Knew him. Was a big fan.
Well, wasn't his major degree program at Yale literary analysis?
Yes. Yes.
And here's a sidebar note that I discovered recently. James Angleton was at Yale at the same time as Harry Jaffa, who was the Lincoln scholar and the head of the Claremont Lincoln Fellowship.
That's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, all these guys, and a lot.
And I think Andrew was a Lincoln Fellow. Was he a Lincoln Fellow or a Publius Fellow? There's 2 fellowships they have at Claremont. But anyway,
I don't remember.
It's a sidebar for me. Sorry.
And by the way, a lot of these guys, when they retired, had novels or screenplays in their drawer that they'd been working on. They were all artists. They're creative people. That's my point, is that they're creative people and they think creatively. And if you think about it, what are they doing? They're constructing narratives. If we've all worked in the film industry. That's what we deal in. You deal with narratives, and it makes perfect sense to me that you would want to, for intelligence people, have people who can think about plots and the way things are going to branch off and characters, and that's what they do. And so, and the reason I mention that is that the CIA seems to me to be the secret police of the elites. That's the function they serve in the world. They're the secret. They are there to protect elites and elite interests. That's why they went to Yale or Stanford or whatever. They all went to these Ivy League schools because, or sub Ivy League like Stanford. But they went to these Ivy League schools. I don't think Stanford's Ivy League, is it? I don't think.
No,
so.
The Ivy League's all East Coast.
Yeah, right. So,
yeah,
but same difference, right? Same difference.
That's what I meant. There's kind of left and right CIA. So
yes, there are, and it's all an act.
And likewise, there's kind of like left and right Mossad, right? You've got the Bibi Netanyahu right-wing Mossad, and then you have the Yahud Barak left-wing Mossad.
Yeah.
Interesting that in that paradigm, then all the left-leaning CIA come from the East Coast, the old Anglo establishment hotbed, and then the right wing come from the West Coast, which is the newer part of the country.
I actually kind of view them as I don't see as much of a separation. I just see it as who's going to play what role.
That's kind of what we're thinking of it as.
Yeah.
It's teams.
I guess the point that I'm trying to make is to think of any of these organizations as monoliths is to ignore the idea that there's ever politics inside organizations, because I think that there always is. Every corporation I've ever worked at, there was politics inside the company.
And there's personal politics, which is this guy screws that guy's wife. No one planned that. And now, look, the Kennedy assassination, that part of that may be, this is what E. Howard Hunt said on his deathbed, was the fact that Cord Meyer,
Who was CIA.
was from the CIA. His wife, Mary Pinchot Meyer, was having an affair with Kennedy. Kennedy was in love with Mary Pinchot Meyer, and she was murdered a year after Kennedy. We know for a fact he was.
Is that the woman who Angleton went over to her house when she died and stole her diaries? Yeah.
And her story is Mary's Mosaic, right? That's the name of the book.
Mary's Mosaic is fantastic, and Ben Bradley, later from the Washington Post, uncovering Watergate. Ben Bradley was a well-known journalist. I think he was at Newsweek at the time. He went over and caught Angleton. Ben Bradley's wife was Mary Pinchot Meyer's sister. So it's a sister-in-law has been murdered. And the first thing they do is try to find her diary so they can burn it, which is what supposedly happened to it. That's crazy, just right there. And Bradley admits to this. If you go to C-SPAN and look up Ben Bradley, Mary Pinchot Meyer, Mary Meyer, or whatever, you'll find Bradley openly admit this towards the end of his life, that he helped this operation with a CIA person to find her diary less than 24 hours after she'd been murdered, a year after her lover JFK, who was in love with her, because letters from JFK to Mary went up for auction a few years ago. So we don't have to guess what John F. Kennedy thought of her, like we do with the intern he was sleeping with during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance. That may have been more of a fling. He was in love with Mary Meyer. They'd known each other from their prep school days. And Hunt said that Cord Meyer, who was the head of Operation Mockingbird, for instance, Cord Meyer was really, even though he and Mary were divorced at the time, hated JFK for it and kind of wanted in on the operation. Now, again, that's what Hunt said on his deathbed. I don't know if it's true, but to your point, Peter, I think sometimes these petty jealousies, who screwed who in a business deal, who was secretly gay and whatever, that stuff has protected society from these people completely taking over. It's the fact that there's infighting amongst them. And so I always try to factor that in my journalism. I just go, they're not a monolith exactly. Not exactly. There are interpersonal jealousies and rivalries and everything else, but at the end of the day, they keep secrets. And they keep secrets. That's part of the purpose of secret societies. If you're in Skull and Bones, rumor has it, and we have reason to believe this, that you lay naked in a coffin and tell your sexual history to everybody, right? So what that means is everybody knows everybody's sexual history, right? So if you're George Bush and you're involved in some circle activity at a Boy Scout camp, you're supposed to reveal that. And now John Kerry knows that because he's Skull and Bones the same time George Bush is, right? He knows.
Yeah, I think you probably also have to add that you've probably been sleep deprived for 3 days, and you've also been inebriated for 2 days at that point.
That's right. No, right, yeah. Yes. And so once you understand, like, this is how there's an actually understandable operation to this. It makes sense. You go, well, why would they? Well, that's why, right? And that's why. And it's been operating that way for, a couple hundred, 150 years, something like that. 150 years.
Well, it's interesting because the conspiracy is that the 1776 that's on the bottom of the pyramid on the $1 bill is actually commemorating the creation of the Bavarian Illuminati, which was founded on May 1st, 1776, which is why May Day is a holiday in all of these socialist countries.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, so, I mean, the problem is always trying to separate. So, for instance, the Illuminati, that clearly was a thing. A lot of this stuff, yes, that absolutely clearly was a thing. There's a Catholic aspect to a lot of this stuff. There's competing
Jesuits, yeah,
and Opus Dei, who Steve Bannon works for. You can find that very easily, actually. Steve Bannon's done work directly for my old boss, and it's when I started to look into that, I started to go, yikes, like, okay.
Is Opus Dei, I'm trying to remember what that is. I know that in the old, on Pacific Coast Highway, you used to live in Los Angeles, there was a building that was owned by a famous movie actress in the 1920s. I'm trying to remember her name. But at one point, the Catholic Church had turned that into their media company in Hollywood. They had an office on Pacific Coast Highway. Was that Opus Dei? What is Opus Dei?
It may have been. Opus Dei is a Catholic secret society.
Okay.
And what you'll find is that every group, basically, the B'nai B'rith is a Jewish secret society, for instance. And there's Catholics and there's Protestants and there's
are secret or discreet? The Masons called themselves a discreet society, whereas everybody knows that they're a society, but nobody knows what they actually do.
So what's interesting is I know somebody who's a Mason and who says there's two different. He said there's Masons and then there's Masons. he says I'm one of the good ones, and I'm taking his word. But that's completely conceivable to me that any of these secret societies are going to have a level on which they operate where they're not secret. But then to get and look, how do you get into the inner sanctum, right? The way you get into the inner sanctum is through knowledge that you're willing to give up, and you're willing to give up certain stuff about yourself. So the further into this stuff you get, the more blackmail material you have on people, but the more blackmail material they have on you. I'm convinced that that's the way they operate over and over again. The B'nai B'rith, for instance, comes up in a case called the Leo Frank case, which I think is one of the most significant cases in American journalism. It was the biggest single postcard writing campaign in the history of the U.S., biggest story in the U.S., and it's completely mangled. And to this day, it involves lynching and stuff like that, created a lot of things. But the B'nai B'rith, is this factory manager, was accused of raping and murdering a 13-year-old. And almost immediately, they put up $150,000 in 1913 money. That's a lot of money in a legal defense for the guy. And so he was the head of the B'nai B'rith in Atlanta. And you just go, and again, it's not, you see it with every religion, you see it with every ethnic group. They have they're all kind of variants on a theme, and sometimes they mix, and that's where you get Bohemian Grove that I mentioned earlier, because Jeff Giese is grandmother ran Bohemian Grove. Giesecke still seems to be a member. And by the way, that's part of the reason I think Alex Jones is a target on his back, because
he went to Bohemian Grove and
he broke in.
He went to Bohemian Grove and broke in, and at a time when people thought there was really like no such thing, like it's all rumor. It's the same way. I'm sure you.
Yeah, the way the story goes with I think it was Adam Weishaupt or Jacob Weishaupt.
Yeah. I know
Adam is a broadcaster and Jacob is the Illuminati guy, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Rothschild was that they came up with this idea that they weren't going to create their own secret societies. And I kind of see this pattern happening over and over again, not just with secret societies, but with all kinds of organizations like the foundations, is that their idea was, we're not going to create our own secret society. What we're going to do is we're going to co-opt the secret societies and then move them into the direction that we want to go in. So what Weishaupt did is that he went to the Masons, who are based on kind of sacred geometry and this ancient Egyptian mysteries. And they started recruiting people who were at the 33rd degree. So they took people who are already at the top of the Masons and they said, hey, you think your secret society is good? We've got another one that's going to blow your mind, and we're going to take over the world. And they started with the Masons, but I believe that they moved on to, they moved to the Catholic Church, they moved to other different places, and just started co-opting the control mechanisms for all of these things. So if you look at the Ford Foundation or the Carnegie Foundation or the any of these big foundations that we've got now, the similar strategy. While the founders of those foundations may have been similarly aligned, I think that they did wind up getting complete control over a lot of those things.
Yeah, and if you look, there's a video I used to play all the time. You can still find it on YouTube. It's a scholar who was at Stanford, and he's talking about Skull and Bones.
Anthony Sutton?
Sutton.
Yeah, he was at the Hoover Institute, right?
So he was at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Anthony Sutton talking about Skull and Bones is the best. Leave the specifics of Skull and Bones out of it. It's the best description of the way these groups work, which is they create the illusion of opposition, right? And so that's why you get Bush and Kerry, both Skull and Bones members, running against each other for president. That's why you get McCain, Republican, working with Biden and Obama to support Khodorkovsky in Senate Resolution 322, something I talk about all the time that nobody talks about. It's the most obvious story in the world. And you create these illusions, and that's what you're seeing right now. So you would think at a surface level, well, if Soros is on this side, well, then he's got to be pro-Chavez because he's on the left and Chavez is a commie. And I get that reasoning, but that's not, in fact, the way it works. And you can check the receipts.
Right. And to that end, I mean, Servando Gonzalez in his book Psychological Warfare and the New World Order points out that, in his assumption, Fidel Castro was working directly for David Rockefeller and Allen Dulles. And after he had taken over Cuba, he was instructed to tell the world that he was a communist when he had no idea at that moment in time what that actually meant. He actually had to be instructed in what the Communist Manifesto was and what the implications of it were. But the Rockefeller-Dulles contingent needed to have a bad guy in the Caribbean in order to manage all of their other operations that they were carrying out at that time.
I've talked about Bill Browder before. One of the most interesting statements is there was a Vanity Fair article about Browder. Browder's the guy, the Trump Tower meeting was about him. His grandfather, Earl Browder, was the head of the U.S. Communist Party. Grew the Communist Party, was a spy for Stalin. Browder is the guy who made billions in Russia for the people upstream from him at HSBC. But they did a Vanity Fair profile on him. And the the reporter asked him flat out, "Do you work for British intelligence?" And he gave a very honest answer, which is he kind of goes, "Well, it's hard to tell who works for who sometimes."
Yeah.
And I think that's that guy telling the truth at that point. I think sometimes these people have no. That's why I've said whenever.
No, I agree. I mean, when I was a photographer back in the day, I was published by Condé Nast a few times, and Condé Nast, if you're in that world, is kind of like the apex of your career and the kinds of things that you can do. And Condé Nast, the Newhouse family are very close to the Rockefellers, and
Yes.
Controlling the culture is something that has been, and I always was, for years I've been trying to figure out how the business model of fashion works, because it doesn't really seem to make sense when you look at all of these fashion shows where they spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to create these elaborate displays of clothing that probably no one's ever going to wear. And then you start to wonder, well, what's the business model there? How does that actually work? Is it really just marketing? Is that what's really going on here? And, Tracy and I talk a lot about the fact that the presentation of things like, Bill Gates becoming the magical billionaire who's now the richest man in the world, or or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever it is, that, are these people actually really that smart, that they become that powerful, or are they constructs? Is that something that has been presented in a kind of a media event? They've been created as the same way that Marilyn Monroe is created as a movie star, or any other Hollywood icon. It's like the old joke is that Washington D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people. Is Silicon Valley Hollywood for money? Is that what it is?
Well, when I started to figure this out, and you guys both lived in L.A., you've been to, I assume at some point you've been or heard of Santee Alley in downtown.
Yeah, sure. No, I had a big client that was right next to there. Yeah.
Right. So Santee Alley, for people who don't know, is you can go buy knockoffs of Chanel and whatever you want. They have knockoffs there, and some of the and I'd been in LA for 10, 15 years, and then I heard about it, and I'm like, my wife, I said at the time, well, let's go down and check this out, and she knows that stuff better than I do, and she was like, some of these things suck. They're just clearly plastic with the Chanel logo on it. She said some of these, I couldn't tell the difference between, because she'd worked retail. She's like, this looks real. And if you think about it, it effectively is real. It's not like Chanel or whoever, any of those designers have access to alchemy and magic ingredients. They're just using cloth, right?
Well, the magic is getting people to take the same cloth with the same jewelry and pay 10 times as much money for it.
Exactly. That's what I realized. I'm like, there is no, it's like there's a Zen story of the $10,000 cup of coffee. Guy climbs top of the Himalayas, and there's a coffee shop there. And they say, we have two cups of coffee. One's $1 and one's $10,000. And he says, well, what's the difference? And he said, the $10,000 cup of coffee costs $10,000. And that's the difference. Because if you buy a $10,000 cup of coffee, you're going to be like, okay, I don't want to take too much. But if it's $1, you just swill it. But there's no difference. There's really no difference. You're onto something there, Peter. And I haven't quite figured out what it is either. But you're definitely onto something.
Well, it is magic. There's a journalist who unfortunately was found hanging in her garage about 18 months ago, named Tracy Twyman, who has covered a lot of the occult world and gone into this, and she has wrote a pretty good book called "Money Grows on the Tree of Knowledge," that's about the magical creation of money, and how she traces it back to the Knights Templar and the Crusades, because people who were fighting the Crusades had to get to the Middle East from Europe, and a lot of them would get robbed on the way. And so the Knights Templar basically created this series of forts where you could give them your money, your gold, at the first fort, and then they would give you a piece of paper that at the next fort down the road they would accept as payment for food and lodging and the types of things that you needed. And they wound up creating the currency system in starting with the Crusades.
Well, the other thing the Knights created were trust, where they would go off to fight and they would leave things in trust. And there's a really good documentary that I had not seen until a couple months ago called The Spider's Web. And it's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's about the city of London, not London, city of London, which is a distinct area. It's got its own mayor.
And the Queen has to ask permission before she can enter
London.
the city of London.
And they talk about, because I heard I didn't quite get it. Then I found this documentary, and now I get it completely. And it goes right along with everything we're talking about, including what you just mentioned, Peter, which is they created these trusts. The Knights created them. And in theory, you don't own this stuff. I give my trust to you, let's say, and then you control it. And so much of the offshore banking system and the secrecy system in places like the Cayman Islands and Guernsey and Isle of Man, places like that, it all comes from that. And that's why I say, when I go, sometimes I worry when I go into this history stuff and I go, okay, so let's go back to the mid 1800s. Some people just want to put needles in their eyes. I know, I can tell, because they don't see it as relevant to what's going on today. And I swear to God, it's the most relevant stuff.
Right.
Yeah, you have to just convince them. We're in season, 35 of this ongoing story about the warring factions in the world. So do you guys want to watch the previous seasons and get caught up? Because that's what you're telling them.
Yes. No, that's a great, very entertainment way to put it. So I like it.
Well, they're interesting characters and just crazy, wild stories. If you liked Game of Thrones, there's a much better version of it that really happened.
No, I made that point on, as a journalist, I'm always dealing with this. I said, I'll put I used to watch Days of Our Lives. And then when I worked at NBC, I'd be in the commissary line next to Patch, and it was very exciting for me. And, but I used to watch Days of Our Lives, and I started watching it when I was like 17 to see if I could understand it. Because a soap opera, you're never going to watch all the previous. There's no way you'll ever jump into Days and watch all the previous episodes. You could jump into Breaking Bad in season 4 and then go, wait, I got to back up. You could do that. Can't do that with a soap. And I was trying to explain to people a lot of times, hosting a radio show or talking about politics, I never know who's coming in and what they know. So how much? So to avoid sounding just like a complete crazy person, I sometimes feel like I got to go back and go, okay, Cecil Rhodes and Quigley and blah, 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 all that stuff. But the problem is, if you're already caught up, you don't need to see that episode. You don't need to see the recap. And it's frankly boring to you. And you're like, okay, come on. I got it. Yes. Right. I know. I got it. Skull and Bones is real. Yes. Okay. What's new? And that's why the stuff at the beginning here, the Venezuela stuff, I think that is new to a lot of people. And I suggest go back and look that up. You'll find everything I'm saying. I'll tell you the other thing at this Powell Giuliani narrative. And again, I'm not even saying they're in on it. I don't know. They could just be ignorant. But I'll tell you the other thing it's done. It's if you just look up Chavez voting system, something like that, all you'll find is these stories with this current narrative in it for page after page. But that's why I said, go look up some of the other stuff. Look up 2004. You know what's actually a good place to start right now is the Wikipedia page on the 2004 Venezuelan recall. They go through and they list these groups. and you'll go, okay, now let me click on the link and then go find the original article. And when you do that, you'll find it. But one of these things these fake narratives do is they bury the real narratives.
Right.
So now all you find is people going, here, Sidney Powell's a hero and she's blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't tell you what you need to know. Then you find the media going, Sidney Powell's crazy. But either way, they buried the real story, which is the CIA was trying to overthrow Chavez for reasons I don't think are good.
Right. And that go on, Tracy.
Well, I was going to go back to the original thing. So looking at that, Lee, and then thinking about the 2004 Ukrainian election, because my thought about this is that this software was developed by the CIA. It's a much easier way to flip countries. It's just flip votes in a machine than to actually have to foment a color revolution. So when you saw that story about the 2004 Ukrainian election, which I couldn't find in any of the other articles that I read about this guy, nobody cited that thing. And then when I go and look it up, it's the Ukrainian election. They don't even talk about it being contested. So I thought that was strange. And then thinking this was the first color revolution. Did they have a plan B, which is flipping these votes using this technology?
They may have. So the trick on that is Ukraine is Ukraine's an interesting country because its history, throughout its history, they will flip sides in an instant. They will. Ukraine basically means borderlands, and that's very accurate. That's where the country is. It's in the borderlands of literally the east and the west. You had the Mongols come in, ancient Ukrainian history. You had the Mongols come in from the east, but they're right next to Europe as well.
The Lithuanians controlled them for a while, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And in World War II, whose side were the Ukrainians on? What year? What part of Ukraine?
Right.
Some of them sided with the Nazis. Some of them, but the Nazis who thought the Ukrainians were idiots.
There were Ukrainian SS divisions, I believe.
There were, but they weren't actually respected by the Nazis. That's why they used a lot of the Ukrainians as guards in the concentration camps, because they had Ukrainian Nazis kind of going to the German Nazis, hey, we're on your side, and we're the superior people too, and the Nazis were kind of going, yeah, well, not so much, and but letting them think, okay, yeah, sure, you guys can be guards or whatever, but the Nazis really disdained them. But Ukraine constantly would flip, constantly, and of course, part of it is very pro-Russian historically. Forget communism, going way back. It's Slavic, right? And so it's a tricky country to figure out because my boss at Sputnik, I asked him about Yanukovych. And when the Trump Tower meeting first started to come out, and Yanukovych is supposedly pro-Russian. And I asked my boss, I said, so Yanukovych, they're saying he's corrupt. Is he corrupt? Now again, he's working for Russian-funded media. He didn't say, no. He said, yes, of course. He said, but they're all corrupt. And then I later met Ukrainian whistleblower, Andrei Telezenko, and I told him what my, boss had said. He said, yeah, that's true. He said, yes, they're all corrupt. So,
right, which brings us back to the whole idea of secret societies and compromise, which is it possible to become a leader in any modern country without having some baggage that people can hold against you? And is the legacy of Joe Biden is that he's got more baggage than any politician in America. I mean, he's more controlled than anybody else. And is the myth of Donald Trump that we all want to believe is that he somehow was not compromised by politics and managed to launch himself into the most powerful office in the land without having to go through that initiation. And that's what actually has created so much animus for him. That's ignoring the fact that he's got all kinds of history with all of these people previous to politics.
I mentioned Khodorkovsky before. Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. He was supported in he was the richest man in Russia during the 90s. Putin came into office, said to all of the oligarchs, they thought he was going to be another pushover. And Putin basically said, it was very public too. He said, I'm not going to take your money. He said, the businesses you take over, it's too much to stop getting involved in politics. Stop trying to take over the government. And Khodorkovsky was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So he ended up going to jail, which is good because he was a bad guy. But after Putin let him out early, and Khodorkovsky wants to replace Putin, Khodorkovsky had built what the Russians call a korisha. So korisha means roof, basically, and it means a shelter. That's the way to think of it. And his korisha was that he had hooked up with the Carlyle Group and the Bushes. He'd hooked up with the Clintons. He'd hooked up with the Library of Congress, where he gave him $1 million. And he put all this lobbying money in, and he bought off people who were investigating him, like Jonathan Weiner. And Khodorkovsky, in an interview in 2016, or maybe 17, but anyone can look this up. He was asked about Trump, and Khodorkovsky said something very interesting. He said, Trump is kind of the leader of the alt establishment. Now, Khodorkovsky is a guy who, when he was put in jail, his controlling shares went to Jacob Rothschild. So he's connected to the real establishment, and he paid the price. And his view of Trump was that Trump was sort of like a wannabe, if that makes sense, who hadn't really penetrated this top level that we've been talking about. And that sounds completely accurate to me. That's what it sounds like, is that Trump is, and that Trump probably doesn't know that.
You don't think, Lee? I mean, it's almost like the nouveau riche versus the ancient money. We're not talking old money. We're talking about forever money.
Exactly.
And they've always turned their noses up at him. What was it? The 21 Club? Is that the club in New York that he tried desperately to become a member of for years? And
he writes about it in his book.
Peter?
Whatever the club is, he writes about it in his book.
Right. They wanted to keep him out. They've always looked down on him.
He's nouveau rich, the short-fingered Bulgarian.
And I think it was Roy Cohn who actually got him into that club.
Yeah,
I think you're right.
I think
and who's connected to Stone, of course, but also knows a thing or two about a little. Cohn's a guy who,
right, and may be connected to Mossad and what's his name, Meyer Lansky, and all of those other people too. So
was connected. By the way, Lansky's another important figure who I really looked into because I'm like, oh, he's significant. And by the way, the reason, I'll just tell you another entertainment conspiracy theory of mine, it's the reason there are no great Jewish gangster films. All the good gangster films are the Italians. They got the Irishmen, he got into a little bit. The reason I say this is because Lansky and the Jewish mob was every bit as vicious, and they refer to Lansky as the mob's bookkeeper. That is not true at all.
Well, yeah, it's not. But it's not. It's not only Lansky and the Jews. It's Alan Dulles flying to Sicily in 1944 and with Patton and Montgomery in order to save the remaining mafiosos who had not been killed by Mussolini, because Mussolini almost wiped the mafia out during World War II. It's the Vatican Bank that was being used to launder all of the money.
Yes. That's right.
It was the Masonic temples that were being used by the mafia in order to organize all their operations. So there's a lot of things that got left out of all of those Godfather movies.
But when I looked into Lansky, I felt in a sense like, well, why didn't I know any of this? Why didn't I know? Because in a way, it's not giving them credit. That's what's weird. In a way, they make them out to be, like I say, the Italians, bookkeepers or whatever. Lansky's really the father of organized crime, modern organized crime in America. Period. and there were Jewish hitmen.
There's a direct connection between Meyer Lansky and O.J. Simpson. You know, it's
between OJ.
OJ, yeah.
What's that?
So Joey Ippolito, there's a really good book called Killing Time, which is the only real kind of investigative journalist coverage of the O.J. Simpson crime. But you know, if you've ever been to my house, I was in the fashion business when that whole thing happened, and I was 1 degree separated from all of those people. So one of the guys who's implicated in that whole thing is a guy named Joey Ippolito. And Joey owned a restaurant called Saint Annie on the corner of West Channel and Pacific Coast Highway, which was famous for being a place where you could go score large amounts of cocaine. And Joey Ippolito, the origin story of Joey Ippolito is that he was a kid running numbers for Meyer Lansky when he was a kid. That's how he started. So
it's interesting. The other Lansky story, obviously, I started looking into is how Lucky Luciano, the Italian mob, and Lansky was the go-between between the FBI and Luciano when they were trying to, at the end of World War II,
Operation Underworld.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yes, and made that connection. And Lansky, to me, I was like, oh, this is really interesting.
Well, Luciano got deported to Sicily when he was an American citizen. How does that work?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But do you know who his partner was in Sicily organizing the drug business for the mafia? A guy named Frank Coppola.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. See, like I said, that's what when I look at, as a film person, again, I love those movies.
Sure. They're great.
And I love the Scorsese movies, but I'm like, why are they continually making the Jewish mob the sidekicks, the bit players? Why are they where's the Godfather? Where's that of the Jewish mob? And I just think that it starts to ask uncomfortable things. And of course, the Lansky family's still trying to get the Riviera Hotel back in Cuba. They're still actively trying to get that back from the Cuban government who took it over. So there's a lot of, but yeah, anybody, like I say, all these side roads, they're not really side roads. And that's why when I see these names come up over, and of course, you mentioned the Mossad connection, and of course, Lansky was very big in the founding of Israel. Very important, provided money and everything else. And Israel comes up all over the place here. And it's not anti-Semitic. It's Israel and Saudi Arabia were both ways for the UK to keep a hold in the Middle East. And that's why the Saudis and Israel have been working together for years. And it's only starting to come out now. And I think that you mentioned Trump I think Trump does have an awareness. I think to some extent, he thought he was buying into that a little bit with the Kushner relationship, because the Kushners
buying into what? Into the higher echelons?
The higher echelons, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Because Charles Kushner, very close to Netanyahu, biggest funder of Democrats in New Jersey, much more central to not just national but international politics, and of course the Murdoch connection, which is Murdoch was Kushner's mentor, and Roger Stone told me that Kushner would talk to Murdoch every day in the campaign, every single day.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I had a hunch, and so I called Roger and I said, well, I'll tell you what my hunch is. So the Trump Tower meeting happened in summer of 2016.
It was July, right?
Yes. When did the story come out about the Trump Tower meeting? Do you remember?
I don't.
It was it was like a year later. Because I was working for Sputnik and I was in the White House at the time when they would all these things. So why did it take a year for that story to come out? And so here's what we know. Kushner was in the Trump Tower meeting. The Trump Tower meeting was about the Magnitsky Act and Bill Browder, and about the Magnitsky Act. If you look up on Open Secrets, the Magnitsky Act is funded by, among other people, News Corp. News Corporation literally paid lobbying for the Magnitsky Act. Now, who's the guy in the room who could get that info to Murdoch? Kushner. Now, Kushner, if you look into it.
Kushner was involved with the Magnitsky Act?
No. He was in the Trump Tower meeting.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. All right.
It was Junior, Kushner, and was Manafort the other one?
Manafort was, and we know Manafort understood it.
Because he took notes. Yeah, he took notes.
And those notes, if you read the notes and you know the story, you go, wow, Manafort understood this. He got that John Ashcroft was involved. He wrote that down. He got it. So Kushner's in the meeting, and Kushner, you can find this very easily, lied about the meeting. Kushner says he left early. Everybody else in that room says he was there the whole time. So why does Kushner lie about being in the meeting? And I think they realized that they had a real problem on their hands. By they, I mean Kushner. I don't know how much he knew, but he was talking. That's why I called Roger. Because I'm imagining Jared Kushner talking to Murdoch every day, and daily phone calls go like this. So what happened today? And Kushner goes, I'm giving the biggest benefit of the doubt. He goes, I was in this weird meeting. There was this Russian lawyer, and she's talking about Magnitsky and Browder, and I didn't know what the hell it was about. But Murdoch absolutely would have, because he funded the Magnitsky Act in 2012. So now they see they've got a real problem. And I think this explains Browder's constant appearances on Fox. They never tell Fox viewers ever once that Browder's grandfather was a spy for Stalin or a communist. Why? Not because it's relevant, because I don't think it is. Because if you're a Fox viewer, hey, everyone, meet Bill Browder. His grandfather was a spy for Stalin. You're immediately going, I don't like this guy.
Right. And he denounces American citizenship too, right?
He renounces U.S. citizenship. Yeah. Hates Trump, lifelong Democrat, working with the Ziff brothers, who are huge Democrat funders. And as I found out later, Derek Shearer, it's right on his Occidental biography, the brother of Cody Shearer, the brother-in-law of Strobe Talbot, central people. Cody Shearer created
Occidental, another Claremont college, right?
Yes, Occidental. If you go look it up on Derek Shearer's bio at Occidental, he worked for Ziff brothers. So this is a guy who absolutely knows about the Magnitsky Act and knows that Natalia Veselnitskaya was laying out a case very clearly that the Ziff brothers were working with Bill Browder to try to take over shares of Gazprom, and were committing tax fraud, not just in Russia, but in the U.S. by using shell companies. You couldn't buy Gazprom shares over a certain amount if you were an American. So what they did was they set up shell companies to put the shares in a Russian company. But really, that Russian company was buying the shares for the Americans. And that's a tax fraud on two countries. You see what I'm saying?
Yep, I do. I mean, it's the status quo, though.
No, it's a standard playbook. But right. I think it took a year for that story to come out, because they were trying to figure out, they were trying to run through the narratives and go, okay, wait a second. If we pitch this wrong, people will, the house of cards is going to crumble, because people will immediately see.
Wouldn't it be great to be a fly on the wall in those meetings?
Well, I want to be a fly on the wall in the Murdoch Kushner.
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe what we should do is just do what Phelan Mackler does and just write it up as a play, and just stage it.
That's occurred to me.
Yeah, it's
I want to do like Altman did with Nixon.
Yeah, it's
But in this one, we don't know how it actually goes. So it's more like, what was the Ayn Rand play? I would imagine that Stranahan, you'll know this. The night of January the 11th, was that
16th.
what it was?
Yeah,
16th. Where you got alt endings and you've got the jury.
Yeah.
My daughter took a class Tracy's laughing. My daughter took a class in college, which was a discipline that I've never heard of before. That was absolutely her favorite class in college, called transmedia design. And it's the idea of creating story worlds across media. So if you're in the music business, what are the videos going to look like? What kind of movies are you going to steer your music towards? What is your social media strategy? How are you going to create characters? How are you going to create fandoms? How do you steer all of that stuff? How do you manage all of that stuff? And the guy who wrote the textbook was the guy who was the instructor in the class.
Well,
And
we've talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
The reason the graphics are cool on my thing is I've been actively working on presenting some of my journalism in the form of interactive stories or video games or interactive presentations that you can walk around like a museum where
yeah.
literally it's like a maze.
Well, let me steer you back.
In the middle.
Let me steer you back towards something Tracy and I talked about yesterday, which was I was appalled by the visual presentation of the Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani press conference. It was like, come on, guys, where's your media advisor? What are you doing? You're in New York City. There had to be 100 rooms in New York City that had lighting packages and air conditioners that they could have rented. But
yeah, no, it's almost like they're trying to screw things up.
yeah.
But again, and
I mean, you have 100 times more production quality, in 1,000,000 times more production quality in your little basement in South Dakota or wherever you are.
it's my technically, by the way, just so you know, it's no, wrong way.
Yeah.
I'll show you my palatial studio. Here's my bed. There you
Right.
go.
Okay.
Here's my bed. So this is a corner of my oops.
Right. And that said, you still have more production value.
I do.
Than Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani.
Because as a photographer, Peter, and Tracy is someone who's been an AD and stuff, outside of this frame, it just doesn't matter.
No,
So
it doesn't.
The only thing that matters is what's in this frame. So my unmade bed right here, it does. The reason I'm in my bedroom is because it's the quietest room. Literally, my living room, which is very big, it's got giant windows, and so this is the quietest. And because I do my radio show from here, that's why I'm here. So I'm cramped into a very, see.
Well, I'm in my palatial studio apartment in Pacific Palisades, where
Chuck, that's it.
where Chuck Johnson has pointed out that the only reason that I can afford to live here is because of communists.
Is it rent
in
control?
California.
Oh, 'cause the
It's not rent control, but there's not enough R2, which is multiple residence housing in the Pacific Palisades. So this building was built in 1924, and the city won't let anybody knock it down and put less than 8 units on the lot. And I don't think that unless they spent a lot of money, that they'd ever be able to get their money out of this lot. So I'm luckily here, but there's a $6 million house there, and there's a $20 million house there, and I'm sitting here in my little apartment. So
Yeah, no, it's Peter, you and I have talked about this a lot because it used to drive Andrew nuts. Just the lack of production value. But right?
no, he's absolutely right, and that's the reason I started taking pictures of people on the right. And the New York Times labeled me the Annie Leibovitz of the alt-right because I was simply just taking my, I'm a good photographer. I'm certainly, I'd be better if I had huge budgets like Annie Leibovitz actually has. But all I was doing a competent job of making people who were saying things that I agreed with look good. And for that, I got, a New York Times Magazine expose about how I'm a terrible person.
But also, you were trying to do the Avedon thing, and not the Annie Leibovitz thing or a David Chappelle. That's a different world.
Sure.
What Annie does is different. But for you trying to do the Avedon thing, and as soon as you mentioned the book you were trying to do, the Avedon book you're trying to do, I had a copy of that book from when I was 16, and was very, very influential, and to me. And,
yeah, I was thinking about it a lot today because Ali has been in Atlanta, doing his stuff, and I was thinking I had some family stuff come up last week, and I wasn't really able to travel, so.
Yeah.
But I was looking at all this stuff, and I was really glad because somebody shot a really good picture of him that's on his Instagram feed in a hotel room doing a Periscope that was very graphic, and I thought it was a great picture. So I'm glad Ali understands aesthetics. That's I mean,
he does. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at his setup, and then if you look at the behind the scenes, like his presentation when he's doing his Periscopes and his live streams and stuff is completely pulled together, but that's because the entire rest of his living room is a complete, productions area, right? It's
as Lee said, it only matters what's in these boxes around us.
It's all right. And the frames, it's literally all I work. So it's a mess over here, but it doesn't matter. And I've also tried to make it so I can move it around and do different looks from this 1 4-foot space. So if I do the radio show, people notice. I do the radio show, I keep this light off, and I'm in the dark. And
you got the silhouette thing going.
And I do lots of weird shots that are like that.
Right.
Because it's radio. But I'm also trying to make it look different than when I do a Periscope. So you don't scroll by. You can scroll by and tell whether it's my radio show or something else immediately, just from the shot selection and the lighting.
Right.
And then, because I got about 4 shows I'm going to be doing from here pretty shortly.
Great. Well, we got a good compliment from Mark Kulak. I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Kulak. He's got another channel also, Lee. Mark does incredible deep dives and then documents everything. So he's the one who connected Bill Barr to the Manhattan Project, if you can imagine that. And
I can. The Barr stuff's fascinating. But I love both you guys. Love talking to you, and we should thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I think we should throw it out and see if anybody has any questions, and then we can let you loose. But we should do this again. We can go jump back to season 15 in the grand narrative of the world chess game.
Tracy and I talk a lot about scaffolding because it's one of the things that the secret societies do, is that the reason that they take you through these initiation degrees is because you have to have a certain amount of knowledge at one level to be able to get to the next level. And we have a similar issue with trying to get people to wake up and understand what's going on, is that for the first level is kind of like, oh, everything you've watched on television is wrong.
Right. I've thought that for a long time. The biggest trick I have is deprogramming people, and the problem is people don't know, for reasons that are 100% clear to me. People don't know what they need to be deprogrammed from by definition. Because how would they?
Right.
They believe it, and they really believe it. So if they believe, for instance, whatever, that the CIA is a force for good and is out for democracy, let's just basic level. You just got to kind of go, okay, well, no, but the next thing out of my mouth is not going to be, and down with the Yankee imperialist pig dogs, and up with the revolution and Che Guevara, because I'm not that.
Right. It's really difficult to get people to understand that there's some stories with no good guys in them.
Yes, especially in modernity, and that like I say, the founding fathers would be shocked. They would be completely shocked. But the problem is, the people feeding the propaganda know that, and so they know that for a certain crowd, we talked about the left and right a little bit. One of the clear differences between the left and the right, just using that as a really broad category, is the left genuinely doesn't like America, and the right genuinely likes America. Now, they can both be tricked into the same wrong conclusions. because I think if you like America, you're not in favor of foreign entanglements and being the world's policeman. That I come to that from a right point of view.
Yep.
My friend Yakov Shapiro, who's an anti-Zionist rabbi, he and I have talked about this. Most people who are anti-Zionist who talk about that, there's two broad categories. One is they're Nazis and anti-Semites or whatever. And so that they don't like Jews, so they're anti-Zionist. Okay, let's throw them out. Then the next category is they're leftist who are they're more pro-Palestinian than anything. And they don't even know why they're pro-Palestinian. They're just pro-Palestinian. And if a terrorist or sure, whatever, they don't care. And I reject those too. And Yakov was saying to me, he said, yeah, I'm not really, he said, the Palestinians, he said, I don't, it's not my issue. He said, I think some of the stuff Israel does to the Palestinians is wrong, but I think some of the stuff India does to the Kashmiris is wrong. And I have just the same emotional connection. And me too. And so when you find people who all they've heard on Israel and Zionism is the damn Jews or yay terrorism, I don't side with either one of those. So for a long time, and it's very tricky. And so that's why when I find a guy like Yakov, who doesn't just have a view, but represents a lot of people, and the media is covering it up, I go, okay, this is important. And it really helped me understand things. But boy, it took me for a long time to get it. And now I think I get it. And now I'm trying to feed what I understand about that into the way I look at neoconservatism and a whole bunch of other things. So,
yeah, my basic, and my daughter makes fun of me for this, but there was Brandy Melville is a clothing store that caters to young ladies in the United States of America, and they sell kind of edgy T-shirts, and one of them is "Cool Story, Bro." And I'm at a point right now where, when I'm watching the news, my basic attitude towards everything coming out of everybody's mouth is, that's a cool story,
Yeah.
I wonder if it's true.
Yeah.
And in the case of most mainstream media, it's not even close most of the time.
No, it's not. And it's very tricky. And like I say, this year going through a divorce and everything, I happen to, God's good. I happen to find a girlfriend who is into politics, but she's not so into politics that she's mental and sees the world broadly the same way that I do. And which means she doesn't fall into these narratives. You know what I mean? Because
yeah, I do.
On one hand, I'm coming out of a 20-year relationship with someone who just towards the end hated politics. And then you get involved with somebody who's not into politics. That'd be hard for me.
Well, it's, politics is difficult because it requires evaluating your belief system and benchmarking it against what you're hearing and seeing and talking about all of the time. And lately, it's been very divisive.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder about, things like Amy Vanderbilt writing that, that you shouldn't talk about religion or politics at the dinner table, and thinking, well, why? Because those are the things that form tribes that are more important than the state. Is that so that you can give the state more power? Is that the point of that? Or, I mean, is it really about civil discourse? I'm not sure.
That's what's been really cool about my new the Backstory show, because I'm the sole host, and it's 2 hours, and we take calls and have guests and all that stuff. I get into religion and politics and music and other stuff, and culture and cooking and other stuff that I'm interested in, and kind of mix it up a little bit. And to me, we had, Albert Guillory. So we get Albert Guillory on, who's the first black Republican in the Louisiana state legislature, but also a professional cook who's got his own catfish recipe. And so it's really awesome to be able, because he's from Opelousas, Louisiana, and I wanted to talk about food. I'm like, Albert, by the way, do you cook? And he said, I'm a trained professional chef. And I said, okay, let's talk about this. But it's fun, but even the cultural stuff, culinary stuff, he and I have talked about this. Peter and I both knew Andrew Breitbart very well. You knew how Andrew talked about e pluribus unum and from many one, and that idea, which has been completely lost. And Albert and I talked about it in relationship to food, where I love cultural appropriation, especially when it's on my frickin' plate.
Right.
We talked about how Cajun food, Louisiana food, not Cajun, because there's Creole, there's Cajun, but Louisiana food, specifically, they stole some stuff from black people, some stuff from French people, some stuff from Spanish people, some stuff from the Scots, Irish.
It's appropriation all the way down.
Yeah.
Exactly right, and it's freaking delicious. And barbecue is the same thing. I'm a barbecue fiend. Barbecue's all about cultural appropriation and stealing some stuff from the Mexicans, but the German sausage makers in Central Texas, German Czechoslovakian, giving Mexicans beer, and that cultural stuff. The other thing, I'll just do this real quick because I'll point it out. The other, because people don't realize the German Mexican connection. That's why you have Mexican breweries, and it's also why you have Mexican music that sounds like right, that beat. What is that beat right there? That's polka.
Papa.
That's polka.
Yeah.
And
And Mexicans have tuba bands too, right?
and that's why they have them. I learned this when I lived in Central Texas, and there's all this Czechoslovakian food, and you go, well, gee, that cultural interplay between the Bavarian influence and the Mexican cuisine influence is why we have delicious sausage from places in Texas, Central Texas.
Yeah, we should celebrate cultural appropriation. It's
Yes.
And
of
it's
course,
why every time a Victoria's Secret supermodel apologizes for wearing an Indian headdress, it just irks me.
Oh, wow. Yeah. All right. Well, there were some questions that came through, but I didn't want to interrupt you guys. So somebody asked Lee, did you work as a reporter in Cleveland?
No.
At any point?
But there are well-known Stranahans in Ohio and Michigan that I have nothing to do with, and Colorado that I don't know them. We're distantly related somehow, but that could be it, because I know that there's a lot of Stranahans in Michigan, Ohio, and the Stranahan's whiskey out of Colorado. There was a sheriff who knew Hunter Thompson named Stranahan, but I don't.
Excellent. Well, I think this is an interesting cultural comment. I don't know if either of you have watched that show, Ozark.
I haven't. I've heard good stuff about it. My girlfriend's from Arkansas, so I've learned a lot about Arkansas. And then I had another couple people I knew from Arkansas, and Arkansas is very interesting to me. It's very spooky.
Yeah.
It is.
It is. It is.
Yeah,
The whole.
Talk about the mob. The mob was in Hot Springs.
Hot Springs.
Exactly. And I don't know anything about it, but my
So,
girlfriend's got some good stories.
And I don't watch TV, so I haven't seen it.
No, I know, but you should. It's a really good story, and it helps people understand how money laundering works and drug trafficking works.
Okay, well, where do you see it?
It's a Netflix original series.
Oh, Netflix. I don't do.
Yeah. Jason
Yeah.
Bateman plays his character. He's just this nice guy that bumbles into these unfortunate situations.
I think my future ex was watching it and liked it, and she had pretty good TV.
It's really, really well acted,
Yeah.
and it's brutal.
This
And
current
they're in the
Fargo-
Ozarks in Missouri on the show. They shoot it in Georgia, but
This current season of Fargo is the only fiction I'm watching now, and it's so depressing. It's fourth season woke Fargo, and the first two seasons especially were brilliant, and the third season was pretty good, and this one is so ham-fistedly woke, and it's got Chris Rock in the lead, and I like Chris Rock too, and it's just like,
When I shoot your pictures again, Lee, we have to do this hand thing that you're doing right now, because
Yeah.
it's really good.
it is really good.
Yeah.
yeah, well,
Well, into the fire with this one. So Alton Sterling and George Floyd Kabuki Theater, Lee, what do you think?
So I was in Baton Rouge for the Alton Sterling shooting. I was there. I got there 24 hours later, and I saw that unfold. I know that story really well. The George Floyd story, I think I know. I lost my former job as the co-host of Fault Lines in part over a conflict on the George Floyd story, where very early there was a lawyer out there saying it seems like the George Floyd story might be excited delirium, and it certainly seems like this might be a defense. And a friend of mine sent that to me, and I couldn't dispute any of it. And so I started talking about that, like within days. I said, this seems like something called excited delirium, where it seems like the cop may have been restraining him, waiting for the ambulance to come so he wouldn't overexert himself and have a heart attack. Because this excited delirium thing is where people, they're on drugs, like we now know Floyd was. And if they keep fighting, they can have a heart attack and die. And I said that about 3 days in to the Floyd story. And my radio partner made fun of me and said, oh, you've got excited delirium. And I said, well, that's not really an answer. And so I felt like, and then it turned out when they finally released the body cam footage, the cops talk about excited delirium. And I was like, there it is. Wow. And that was the start of a conflict that led to that show ending. And the Alton Sterling thing, he was a guy who was selling bootleg CDs outside the local
mini mart or whatever.
Mini mart, yeah, which is where the first protest went up. And again, I've been there. I bought chips. I talked to the guy who owned it, and I interviewed a lot of people there. And it's Kabuki Theater is a little. It's deeper than that. So the basic cycle goes like this. You get rid of the criminal justice system, and culturally you promote crime. And then you also do it through the welfare system, where you put people in Section 8 housing or give them money for welfare, but you don't quite give them enough money to live on. So they can't just live on the money. They've got to do some side hustle in order to make ends meet. And if they're honest, they'll clean houses on the side or wash cars on the side. If they're a little less honest, a little bit, they'll engage in victimless crimes. They'll
sell cigarettes,
do sexuals, or minor hooking. It's sort of casual, a couple times a month hooking, that kind of thing. And if you get down, then they'll steal a TV every month or whatever and sell it, and that's what they do to pay for it. So they create an atmosphere of crime where you almost have to do something else. And then that creates a crime, and then you create complete disrespect for police, particularly among black youth. And Albert's talked about this as a sometime cop. He said it's gotten nuts among black kids in the past decade or so, where they just don't care. And they make it very clear they have no respect for you whatsoever. So then that creates heightened crime. And that heightened crime is going to create heightened police shootings. Because if people resist arrest, which they do fairly frequently, someone's going to get hurt at some point. Then you use that to say, see, we're not being treated fairly. And then the whole cycle starts again. And so it's a complex ecosystem of misery for black poor people. And then it creates an atmosphere where they feel not inaccurately that they're targeted to some extent without seeing that there's a reason they're being targeted. Because if you're wearing a do-rag and your pants are hanging down and you're not criminal, but your cousin who you're hanging out with is, and you're a cop, you have no way of knowing, oh, that guy's good and he's bad. It's crazy. And so I think it's more complex than kabuki theater, but they've set it up in order to try to push agitation is what I would call it. It's not theater. Theater's non-participatory. Agitation is it's less kabuki and more of a Gallagher routine, where they're going to make sure you're hit with watermelon or whatever. This could be a bad racial reference now I think about it, but you see my point. I fell into that one. I didn't know Gallagher was so racist, but who knew?
Neither did he.
But they're trying to set up. It's more like a Gallagher, or in an extreme case, a Gigi Allen. If you don't know who that is, don't look it up. A Gigi Allen show where, and it ain't watermelon. We'll put it like that. But it's more participatory than that. And
right.
People really do. If you're at a Gallagher show, you're going to get hit with melon in the first few rows. That's why they hand you the rain gear. And It's not just you're watching it. It's you're in it. It's like an escape room or something like that. So it's my weird punk rock.
So here's a question I want to, or something that somebody poses. I can't understand why they don't point to George Floyd and say, "Don't be a drug mule. He was hooping fentanyl." Here's they who, the media, because it doesn't fit their narrative, because their job is not actually to tell you the news. Their job is to tell you what to think and
participate in the agitation that Lee was just talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And so you need to, my advice is stop thinking that they are looking out for your best interest, because that's not their job. Their job is that's Lee's job. People like Lee got into this and have integrity and are going down this road. And that's what Tracy and I didn't want to do. We don't want to do this for a living. This is not really. I like taking pictures. I think Tracy likes producing motion pictures and television. Andrew, the first night I met Andrew, and this, because I've talked about it many times. Andrew very adamantly, because at the time he was hated and being called a racist for the Shirley Sherrod thing, and he said, "I'm fine with it because I'm not a racist." He said, "I sleep well at night because I'm not a racist." He said, my adopted sister is Hispanic, and his biggest problem with her was she was a deadhead, and it wasn't Hispanic, this Hispanic part. He thought everyone should sleep together. That was Andrew's. Andrew's theory was Halle Berry would solve racism, or Lisa Bonet, or whatever would solve racism, because he said, I think he probably, because he said this all the time. Peter, you may have even heard him say it, but that's what he felt like was that was the solution. But the one thing I got from him out of that was, I'm not afraid of being called racist since I'm not racist. Right.
And therefore, when I get into a discussion, this is part of where it got heated on my old co-hosting gig, is it got to the point where my co-host was calling me a race baiter. And I said, that's disgusting, and I'm not going to put up with it. And I said it on the air.
And he's a guy who knew you better than anybody.
Yeah.
You'd think.
I have two roommates, actors, who both disowned me after Barack Obama got elected, both claiming that I was a racist, and that was the reason that I didn't like Barack Obama, even though they both had years of living in the same apartment and house with me.
Yeah.
With no demonstration in any way, shape, or form of any racist word, action, or idea coming out of me. But because I simply didn't like what Barack Obama was doing, their assumption about me was that I must be a racist.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and my brother and I were talking about this yesterday or the day before. I just didn't grow up in a house where I ever heard the N-word or anything. My dad was a golf pro, and back in the 50s, there was a black player on the tour, and nobody wanted to room with him. And my dad, who went to Oakland Tech for high school, was like, I don't even see the problem.
Right.
Like, why won't anybody room with the guy? And he roomed with him, and he was like, he just literally didn't even understand it. And
I was appalled when rap came out and the N-word started to become vernacular. Like, how did that my thought was, how did that happen? This is not good.
I'll tell you do you want to hear my entertainment theory on that? Because I was working in Hollywood when NWA hit. And I was working at the corner of Hollywood and Highland. It's a place, I think it's still there, Memories of Hollywood. It's a gift shop. And in the back, they had a green screen and a video setup, and people could come in and do videos. And I saw it. I saw local people from South LA come up to record their videos there. And I could see previously to that, rap was like Big Daddy Kane and Public Enemy. Then NWA hit. But at the same time, Richard Pryor, I think it was his third concert movie came out. He did his first Richard Pryor and Sunset Strip, absolutely brilliant stand-up. Then he did his second movie. Then he did the third one, I think it was the third one, right after he caught on fire, smoking crack and everything.
And when you're on fire, people get out of your way.
That's right, yes. And he had a routine in there. And in the first, he had an album, Bicentennial, N-word, blah, blah, blah. He used to drop the N-word constantly. And in the third film, which came out right about just before that, Pryor came out and said, and Andrew was a huge Pryor fan like I was. We didn't know each other, but both of us. He was the funniest guy on earth at that time. And he came out and he said, you may have noticed I'm not saying the N-word anymore. And he told a story. He said, I went to Africa. And he said, I'm looking around, and he said, oh, that guy looks like Leo. That guy. But he said, I looked around, he said, the word hadn't gone through my head. He said, I didn't see any N-words. And he said, I'm not going to do that anymore. And I thought that was a really culturally significant moment, because the guy who'd been dropping that word said, you know what? I'm not going to do it anymore. And within a year or so, NWA came out, who's got the N-word built into their name.
Right.
And it just changed everything. But I thought that was a huge step back. I thought Pryor had almost
me too. Me too. Like it wasn't part of my life. I mean, there was more racism talked about in the media in the last 10 years than the entire rest of my life. Yes. I just it wasn't part of my experience. I mean, Martin Luther King did his thing. The world changed. Everything was okay. I understand that there was pockets of stuff in the South and things like that where that stuff probably always is going to exist. But for me, it was, that wasn't my experience of life. So
no, it was yeah.
Anyway,
and it's now gotten so ridiculous that I've talked to my girlfriend. I want to open a Southern restaurant in Russia, just because I think it's a great concept. And I would absolutely have a Confederate flag. I never liked it, but I was watching The Last Waltz, the band film.
Even knowing that the British built the Confederate fleet, and that
it's purely just an FU.
Yeah.
If you watch The Last Waltz and all the interview segments with the band, they've got. I was playing the video for Civil War, that I forget where Guns N' Roses was doing it. Huge crowd. Axl comes out. He's got a Confederate flag jacket that says Rebel. Halfway through Civil War, he does a costume change because he's Axl, and he's down the American flag thing. I'm like, he couldn't do that today, and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because Civil War's a pro-peace song.
One of Kanye's first designs was a Stars and Bars jacket that he built, that he designed.
Yeah, I like Kanye a lot. His gospel album is fantastic, and I like Kanye a lot.
He's going to be a great president in 2024.
Yeah. I will tell you, my girlfriend, that's who she voted for. Yes. She's in Arkansas.
Good for her.
She wasn't going to flip any.
No.
Anyway.
Though.
So, Tracy, should we wrap this up?
I think so. I think that's a
Okay.
good spot. Talking about 2024 and Kanye's coming back and
Yeah.
winning big.
Anyway, well, thanks, Lee, for joining us.
Yes.
And we'll have to do this again soon sometime.
Yeah, we'll have to do a Browder deep dive with you. That would be a fun one.
Anytime. Yeah. Obviously, I'm ponderous.
All right. And if anybody wants to follow Lee, your show is called The Backstory. It's on Sputnik. You can find it via his YouTube channel. And then while you're here, make sure you're subscribed to ours. And we'll see you next week, I guess, if not sooner.
Very good. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye.